Hello, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and members of the Council. Kevin Riper, Chief Financial Officer. Tonight's topic is the fiscal year 2021 budget mid-year review. The recommendation is the City Council receive an update on the latest fiscal year 2021 revenue and expenditure projections for major funds. Second, that Council approve a budget appropriation request in the amount of $16,066,093 across 37 different funds for a combination of primarily capital expenditures and reductions, and also operational expenditures. Also, that Council adopt a resolution approving amendments to the position control resolution to modify staffing in several departments for a net increase of 4 positions. Fourth, that Council adopt a resolution approving amendments to the classification and salary resolution for the Information Technology Director and the paramedic classifications. And 5, authorize changes to the list of equipment financed by the existing Bank of America line of credit for the Information Technology and Police Department equipment. I'm going to go through the pro formas for the 5 major funds: the General Fund, the Measure O Fund, and the Water, Wastewater, and Environmental Resources Enterprise Funds. Let's start with General Fund revenues, for which there's dramatic change since the adopted budget. And that change is obviously the voters' adoption of the Measure E 1.5-cent sales tax, technically called the Transactions and Use Tax, which is expected in the April through June quarter of this year to generate $10.75 million for the General Fund. The Measure E 1.5-cent sales tax starts to be collected on April 1st. A second big change to revenue estimates in the General Fund comes in the category of intergovernmental revenue over here, number 8. Intergovernmental revenue is expected to be for the current fiscal year $4 million higher than we assumed in the mid-year in the adopted budget. And the reason for that is 2 infusions of federal CARES Act money, one through the state for $2.5 million and another through the County of Ventura for $1.4 million. That accounts for the increase in intergovernmental revenue. And the third largest revenue increase compared with the adopted budget is in the base Bradley-Burns 1% sales tax. Back in the depths of the recession, when the budget forecast was made, everybody projected that strapped consumers would be spending less money and therefore less sales tax would be generated. And in the event, consumers in the country and in California and in Ventura County and in Oxnard did spend less money, but they cut back way more on spending on services than anyone thought, and less than folks predicted, including me, on spending on goods. Well, in California, services are generally not subject to sales tax, but goods are subject to sales tax. So while consumers were continuing to buy cars and light trucks and home improvement materials and supplies, and as the staff report says, even video game consoles, those things are all taxable. They purchased much less of services like healthcare, because many healthcare services proved to be unavailable with the depth and the extent of the pandemic related to COVID-19. And many service-related offices were, service-related providers were closed due to the shutdown. Well, none of that was obvious at the time of the budget forecast. So everybody in California, and I suspect in other states, although I don't know that for sure, overestimated the negative impact of the recession on sales tax. So our sales tax estimate right now is 11% higher for the current fiscal year than we forecast back in the spring. So that's the revenue change. The bottom line on this table is that general fund revenue is now projected to be $17 million higher, 1/8 higher than the adopted budget assumed. Now let's go over to expenditures. So here's general fund expenditures. General fund expenditures, in sharp contrast, are expected to end the year only $2.5 million higher, less than 2% than the adopted budget. And there's a couple of major areas where expenditures are changing significantly. Let me touch on 4 of them. The biggest one is in the fire department. The fire department is projected to spend $3.5 million more than its adopted budget appropriation of $20.3 million, and there are 3 reasons for that. First, the wildland fire season ran from August to what Chief Hamilton tells me is an unusually late December of 2020. And during that wildland fire season, the fire department spent $1.5 million responding to wildfires in other jurisdictions. All $1.5 million spent by the fire department either already has been or will be reimbursed by the California Office of Emergency Services and or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So for that $1.5 million, no net impact to the general fund. But the other $2 million of unexpected fire department expenditures arise from 2 factors. Fire spent or will spend about $400,000 this fiscal year of additional station coverage, costs, and overtime in order to cover their minimum staffing requirements while other fire department personnel had to quarantine. So we didn't factor that into the operating budget either because we didn't know that would happen. And finally, the fire department's adopted budget assumed about $1.2 million of vacancy savings. The council may remember that we had a similar issue in the mid-year budget review a year ago at this time, where it looked like the fire department was going to be over its adopted budget by about $2.25 million. And because station coverage station coverage and overtime costs go up because there are minimum staffing requirements in the fire department at all the stations, regardless of how many vacancies there may be throughout the department. So vacancy savings get eaten up by station coverage and overtime in order to keep minimum staffing. So a year ago at this time, we thought fire was $2.2 million short, and we put $1 million in the recommended and adopted budget for fiscal year 2021, the current fiscal year, at budget adoption last summer, and that has proven not to be enough. The $1.25 million, the $1.2 million I mentioned a moment ago of expected vacancy savings was too optimistic, and we will not do that in future years. But this year, it means $1.2 million needs to be added, about $1.25 million needs to be added to the fire department budget for station coverage and overtime related to minimum staffing. Much smaller changes, plus $0.8 million in the community development department. These are expenditures that community development made for temporary labor and consulting costs and other costs related to, and I'm going to go back a page, related to increased revenue that the community development department generated in building fees and permits and a couple of other areas. So community development department, going back to the revenue page, to the expenditure page, no net impact to the general fund from this increase in expenditures because they were required in order to generate the additional general fund revenue. 2 minus $0.8 million changes, 2 reductions in expenditures by $0.8 million. One's in the recreation division of the Cultural and Community Services department because most of the recreation programs were suspended during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so expenditures were way down. And on that previous page, it also reflects a reduction in recreation revenue. So no net impact to the general fund from that change either. And finally, there is a positive impact to the general fund from the police department, generating vacancy savings of even more than was assumed in the adopted budget, vacancy savings of about a little more than $750,000 a year. So put all those 4 large factors together with the smaller ones, and you get a $2.4 million projected increase by year end in general fund spending compared with the adopted budget. So where does that leave the general fund as a whole? It leaves it in substantially better condition than we thought when during the spring when the forecast was made and during the summer when the budget was adopted. General fund started the year with an available fund balance of $12.8 million. So if I'm going to go back up one page. If we look at general fund revenue, current revenue estimate of $152 million, and now back down to the expenditure page, minus currently expected general fund expenditures of $143 million, that leaves a net annual activity or operating surplus of $9 million. Add a $9 million operating surplus to a $13 million starting balance, and you get a $22 million projected ending available fund balance at June 30th of this year. That's more than 15% of expenditures, fund balance expressed as a percentage of expenditures. Your policy target is only 12%. So we're already 3 percentage points above your policy target, 10 percentage points better than the adopted budget assumed, essentially all because of Measure E revenue and the CARES Act revenue from the federal and state government that I mentioned. So that's the general fund picture. Now the Measure O fund, a little less complicated story there. Measure O revenue for the current fiscal year is expected to be about $1.5 million higher than the adopted budget, and that's because the half-cent sales tax, just like the Bradley Burns base 1% sales tax I described for the general fund, has performed better than expected during the depths of the recession. On the spending side, not much change in expected spending, just slightly down $750,000. So that leaves the fund balance picture for the Measure O fund, having started the fiscal year, July 1st, 2020, with $9.4 million. We're going to receive almost $17 million, but spend $22, according to the departmental projections of what they'll spend of Measure O by the end of the fiscal year. That's a net annual activity of minus $5 million, $5.3 million, operating deficit, if you will. So you take a $9.4 million starting fund balance, subtract a $5.3 million operating deficit, you get a $4 million ending fund balance, or about twice what was assumed in the adopted budget back in the spring. On to the enterprise funds. We'll start with the water fund. Not much change in water fund revenue. Fees and charges, base water costs or regular water costs to all users, down about $1.25 million. Most of that due to lower sales of recycled water. An interesting line here is that second line. While it's not a big number in terms of revenue, delinquent fees and charges, which fall into the category that the accounting system calls fines and forfeitures, delinquent fees and charges are down more than 3/4, and that's because during the pandemic, delinquent fees and charges for all 3 enterprise funds have been suspended. So we have a $2 million decline in estimated revenue, but that's only 2.4% on an $84 million base. So not much change there. In contrast, expenditures, are way down, projected expenditures, because of significantly reduced CIP and capital related expenditures compared to what was assumed in the budget. They're all lumped into a category called here other O&M expense. But this decline of expected year-end expenditures for the water fund is due almost entirely to delayed capital improvement program spending. That leads, there's some other capital outlay, not bond funded, that is also assumed to be only about half of what was projected in the budget. So those two protracted, delayed capital expenditure items mean that $34 million less than expected is likely to be spent by the Public Works Department's water division in the current fiscal year. So that's down about 1/3. However, Public Works will recommend that we carry over a little over $30 million of those deferred capital expenditures, those delayed capital expenditures next fiscal year. So here's how the ending available fund balance for the water fund works. It started the year at $52 million, bringing in $82 million of revenue, or 81.6, spending 70.6, so net annual activity of plus 11, an operating surplus, if you will. So you add 52.2 and 11, you get $63 million to the good, but you project a carryover to the CIP for next fiscal year of more than $30 million, and the projected ending available fund balance for the water fund is $32.5 million. That represents 46% of total expenditures plus transfers out. So 32.6 divided by 70.6 is 46%. And your policy target is only 25%. Similar story for wastewater, which is the next pro forma. Significant reduction, I'm going to start with expenditures. Significant reduction in capital spending, only about 30% of what was budgeted for O&M and capital is likely to be spent in the wastewater fund, has this number here and the minus 69%. And that is accompanied by a similarly large reduction in the drawdown of the state revolving fund loan that finances the capital projects that are budgeted. So when capital spending in a particular fiscal year goes down, so too does the expected revenue from the state. So that's why we have big minuses in proceeds from the loan up on the top on revenue. Not much else going on in wastewater or in wastewater revenues or expenditures compared to budget, except to note again that just like with water, there's a 3/4 decline in expected delinquent fees and charges because of the suspension of those charges during the pandemic. So where does that leave the wastewater fund? It started the year with a $46.7 million available fund balance. It's spending 50, it's going to receive revenue of 50, spending 40, so plus $10 million in net annual activity or operating surplus, if you will. But just like with the water fund, the Public Works Department will recommend carrying over about $36 million of CIP to next fiscal year. So take $46.7 million, add a $10 million operating surplus, subtract $36 million of carryover, leaving a projected available fund balance at June 30th of this year of $20 million, which is exactly half of total expenditures of 40.4. Your target is 25%, so the projected fund balance is twice the target level. On to environmental resources. Very little change in revenue here. On the spending side, O&M expense down by 1/4, mostly because of some capital spending that will be deferred to next fiscal year. So that leads to almost no, negligible reduction in revenue, but a significant reduction, 15%, in projected total spending for the Environmental Resources Fund. It started the fiscal year at a fund balance of $34 million. It's bringing in 52, it's spending 54, so net annual activity and operating deficit, if you will, of minus $2.5 million. Also subtract $5.5 million, this is probably a minus sign. Also subtract $5.5 million for CIP carryover, we get a projected ending fund balance of $26 million at June 30th of this year, or a little less than half of total expenditures of 54. And once again, as for the other two enterprise funds, your target reserve level is 25%. In the request for budget appropriation that accompanies this item, as the recommendation says, covers 37 different funds, so I obviously am not going to go over all of them. There are some that are definitely noteworthy. The IT fund needs a balance sheet appropriation to pay its dozens and dozens of vendors who assess their charges for software license and usage ahead of time. So IT already has or will get invoices for over $400,000 that don't apply until next fiscal year. So it doesn't hit fund balance, but we do need an appropriation from City Council before we can make those payments for prepaid software licenses and usage charges to the IT vendors. There are a lot of adjustments to the budgets of the various special district funds, and those are mostly for, on the expenditure side, special projects like irrigation and tree planting and landscaping scattered across the various enterprise funds. There is a significant $0.9 million recognition of revenue. That's not a spending item, it's a recognition of revenue in Fund 172, Landscape Maintenance District Administration, because the revenue was inadvertently omitted from the adopted budget document. So we're asking to correct that error. And then $2.3 million of new community development block grant funding as the housing department continues to rake in substantial amount of federal grant money, and the corresponding appropriation is detailed in the budget appropriation request to spend that money. Another recommended action is that City Council amend the position control resolution with a separate resolution attached to the staff report. I'll go through in the order in which the staff report lays them out. There's a recommendation to add an executive assistant to the City Council budget. That's $55,000 in new cost for the rest of this fiscal year. In billing and licensing, there's a reclassification. There's no budget adjustment there, no budget impact. In the finance department, near and dear to my heart, a recommendation to add both a confidential administrative assistant and a second assistant chief financial officer. That's a partial year cost of almost $60,000 because it'll take us a while to recruit. Next year's cost, I just did a rough estimates, probably 4 times this amount. The full year cost would be 4 times this amount. So the reason for this is extensively covered in the staff report. We're now far enough into the implementation of the Tyler Munis core financials software as part of the big ERP project to have a sense, a distressing sense of how much more work is coming the finance department's way once we go live in 2022. There's going to be all kinds of care and feeding of the database, validation, testing, training of the operating departments, and a lot more financial reporting because the power of the software with the information all in one place allows for much better data extraction and reporting. And operating departments are going to need help getting that data out and learning their own reporting, and us training newcomers to the organization. It's just a lot coming, both administratively and at a high management level, hence the request for a second assistant CFO. Fire department request to add 1.0 FTE paramedic at a $31,000 year cost for the rest of this fiscal year to help with pandemic response in the fire department. Continuing on the position control resolution, there are a bunch of additions and deletions in the resolution, the recommended resolution for the police department, which are simply to allow employees to be promoted up to the full journey level. And you can read the different pluses and minuses in the resolution itself. There's no budget impact from this. And similarly, no budget impact from reclassifying a water operations division position. The next resolution proposed for amendment is the classification and salary schedule resolution, which would increase the salary range for the IT director, a position currently vacant under recruitment, in order to achieve market comparability and improve chances for an eventual successful recruitment. And then second and finally, the classification and salary schedule resolution proposed would establish an hourly salary range for the new paramedic position I described on the previous slide. And then the last piece of the whole mid-year review is a request that the City Council authorize the IT and the police department to tap the Bank of America line of credit, relatively small amount remaining on that, but enough to cover 2, coincidentally, $50,000 projects. One's a security-related construction project that would resolve an audit finding, that's for IT, and the police department needs some furniture related to their dispatch console project. So we would lease purchase both of those because the equipment will last 5, 7, 10 years, somewhere in there. That returns us to the same 5 recommendations I read at the beginning and concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.